Well, thank you all for being here this rainy Saturday. We're thrilled to have Diane still with us, and I think this is good. We get to sit down for this one, right, Diane? We have had her working. She's been touring and going to dinners and all sorts of events, so this is the last one we get to sit down. And as so many of you have seen the show and had a chance to read the labels, what you don't get to hear is kind of the background story of how Diane's interest in art began, some of the great stories behind the paintings. If you've been on a tour, you've heard some of the stories, but all of those paintings up there, I mean, she's built the collection over 30 years. It truly is an amazing survey of the history of American art, and that's kind of how we've arranged and presented it. But I thought it would just be a nice opportunity for us to talk a little bit about how Diane got interested in collecting, some of the great stories behind how some of those works came to be in her collection, and how they fit into the vision that she has for her foundation. So I thought, first I would, Diane and I were talking, actually we were walking back to the hotel last night about our shared place that got us interested in art. So I thought maybe, Diane, you could tell about your story with the Metropolitan Museum of Art and its important role in how you came to love art.
Yeah, I was very surprised as we were walking back, and I've known John for 5 years, and I'm totally impressed with his capability, his knowledge of art, his enthusiasm. And it wasn't until last night, walking back to the hotel, that I learned that we actually shared the same beginning interest in American art and in art in general. And when I was a youngster, my mom used to take me to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And I would go there and I'd be absolutely mesmerized by the paintings, the enormity of them, the scenes. It took you to a different place. It just stayed there with you, and it just filled my soul. But what I have shared was that I wasn't the one in the family who really wanted to go to the Met. It was my little sister who ended up becoming an artist and an art teacher for many, many years. I wanted to go because we could go to Horn and Hardart, which was an automat. You put a nickel in the slot, and you opened the door, and you could get chocolate cake. And then by magic, another piece of chocolate cake appeared after you got yours. And then last night I learned that his mother took him to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but it wasn't chocolate cake, it was...
We went to the cafe 1 block over on Madison. We had hot cocoa afterwards with marshmallow cream on top.
Right.
That was the best.
So
you were good though, because you actually went and liked I liked the paintings and sculpture too, but my favorite part was the Japanese gardens with the koi pond.
Oh.
I love to go drag them back there. So yeah.
So we both loved chocolate. We bonded over chocolate. After 5 years, I finally heard that story.
It was great. So and so Diane, fast forward a little bit, because you started collecting years ago, but I think people would love to learn how you came to establish the foundation and kind of its mission. And I have one image here about the guy that kind of spearheaded that, perhaps. I wonder if you talk about him a little bit and how he came to kind of kick things off, so to speak.
Okay. That's my late husband. And I didn't know that the picture was going to be up here, so it's a little bit emotional. But I was the one who really loved the art and pursued it aggressively. And he was busy turning around a bank. He was the CEO of a major bank, and it had been in kind of trouble. And he worked non-stop on that bank. And that's when I moved to St. Louis, and I went back to graduate school to get my PhD. So he unfortunately, in 2001, our whole world changed, and he was diagnosed with a very difficult form of leukemia. And as hard as we tried to find a donor, we weren't able to. And he was told that his leukemia was terminal. And this is a man who was enormously successful as a banker. I mean, enormously successful. And he was sitting in his hospital bed with a yellow legal pad. He was a real strategic planner. And he wrote down what he wanted his legacy to be. And the legacy that he wanted was the art. Now understand, he wasn't really that into art. But at the end of his life, He wanted something that would endure. Ars longa vita brevis. Art is long, life is short. And mind you, he was chairman of the symphony, chairman of the Boy Scouts, chairman of the United Way campaign, a strategic planner for the university, and then he became CEO, became chairman of U.S. Bancorp through multiple mergers. This was a man who was enormously, enormously successful. But at the end of his life, he asked me, would you please develop the collection so that when it's in a museum, it would be transformative. Transformative was the word that he wrote down. What does it mean to be transformative with American art? Because most people don't know about American art. They don't get the kind of coverage that the great Impressionists and Picasso and all of those people, they don't know. And therefore my job was to make sure that I built a collection that was educational, that let people understand the breadth and depth of American art, that discovered artists that people hadn't known about very much before, and to build a collection that would end up being shown in a museum and that it was transformative to the community that got to see it. And I'm hoping that all of you will go upstairs and look at the collection, and you'll invite your friends and your families and your relatives and teach them about American art. And the catalog really, really does teach about American art and all that's involved in trying to tell the story of what it's like to have to build a collection of American art.
Yeah.
So that's basically, he was a great guy.
Yeah. And up until now, I mean, you've been fulfilling that mission by everything you see upstairs, probably at least half, 2/3 of those works up there weren't just, Diane didn't just collect and keep things in her apartment and in her foundation offices for her own pleasure. She acquires major works of American art and shares them with museums across the country. So, we picked up works from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon, down to West Palm Beach, Florida, from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, St. Louis Museum of Art, San Antonio Museum of Art, and gather them all here. So they're truly being shared with the public, but this is the first time they've all been brought together.
And this is the first time I'm seeing them together. Ever since I bought them,
Yep.
I haven't seen them. I had them long enough to be able to restore them, to be able to make sure they were properly framed, restore the frames. In some cases, had to go and find just the right frame.
Yep.
But you can't imagine how overwhelming it was for me to see it all displayed here for the first time.
Yep.
It was magical. And also to know that the legacy request that my husband made has been fulfilled because of the Mint Museum.
Yeah.
And I thank you all so much for that,
Yeah.
especially you and Todd and all the members of this wonderful museum. It's really been heartwarming.
And I will say, to give a sneak peek, American art is not, it's the main part of your collection, but if you look up there, Diane has many interests, and her collection also has many parts. And so I just wanted to share with you a little bit other aspects of the collection. I mean, you've started to build a really remarkable collection of works by indigenous artists. You have fabulous decorative art, and people get to see some of those. Diane is kindly lending 2 of her works to an upcoming exhibition at the Mint that my colleague Brian Gallagher is organizing. And then on your right, the other major part of her collection that people may know a little bit better up until now is her amazing collection of American seating furniture, which likewise, like the painting and sculpture collection, surveys the history of that form of art in this country. It's been to 28 venues across the country over the past 15 years, probably. And we are going to be very excited to present that to you next fall. So you'll get to see a little bit more of Diane's collection as well.
That's how I met Todd, by the way.
Yep.
He was the chief curator, I believe, at the museum in South Carolina. And he did the chair show there. And I will tell you, but don't tell the rest of the venues, it was the best show of all 28 of them. I said, this fellow knows how to put on an exhibit. And
Until
then,
next fall, then we're going to make it even better. Right,
oh,
Todd?
okay.
We'll do it together.
That's the challenge. It'll be fun. You're
It's a
going to love the
challenge.
chair show. It's really fun.
It is. And so I thought we could start with talking a little bit how the collection developed. And this, I think, is one of the earlier works that you acquired. And so from the beginning, I mean, you can look at this beautiful painting by Edward Redfield up here upstairs. Diane always has an amazing eye for quality. And I think an artist like Redfield, he's fairly well known within American art circles, but maybe not to the broader public. But she saw this painting and I think felt like it was just an absolutely beautiful painting. And so that's something that's kind of guided her vision over the years, is not only acquiring works by kind of the big names, but also by a broad range of artists. And so I thought these two works here were great examples of the way that Diane has really worked to paint an inclusive picture, a broad and inclusive picture of all of the different artists that make up the world of American art. So I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, Diane, how I think the collection has really grown to be incredibly inclusive. And so we've got work by Sarah Miriam Peel there on the left and Alan Rohan Cricht on the right.
Well, one of the things that I decided early on, before it became fashionable, is I wanted an inclusive collection. I wanted something that represented America and America's huge diversity of, Asian Americans and people of color and various ethnic backgrounds. And you go to museums all over the country, and for a long time, and I went to museums all the time. I was with IBM such a long time, and every chance I had to go out of town, I always went to a museum, even if it meant I had to take the red eye to get back to work on time. So I went to museums. But when you go to museums, you do not necessarily see the tremendous diversity of our population. And being a woman, let's face it, it was a challenge for all those years working my way up the corporate ladder. And I think the women in the audience are kind of nodding and saying they've gone that path. But it's also been a challenge for people of color and for people who are Asian Americans and a variety of immigrants that we've had in our country. So I really wanted a collection that represented America. And so you see this woman here. I have to turn a bit to see what he's decided to show you today.
And to Peel.
Oh, Sarah Miriam Peel. Now that, you had to buy for the hairdo alone. I mean, she's just incredible. And the artist is really important. But then the Alan Cricht is a wonderful scene of kids playing outside and scooters and just a really happy scene.
And I think too, I'm going to move ahead a little bit. This speaks a little bit to your broadening the collection with, I think if you look at most of the collection, you'll find one major work by each artist. But in the case of Henry, we had already kind of chosen the Henry for the show, but Diane keeps buying. That was the thing, as we were working on the catalog, when you're working on a checklist for an exhibition, you get to a point where kind of things have to stop because the catalog has to go get printed, or the exhibition needs to get laid out in the galleries. But Diane continues to acquire, and this is an example of one that kind of late in the game, we still got it in the catalog and in the show. But she already had the Henry on the left there, the beautiful Spanish portrait, but then she acquired the one on the right, and I think it's a really personal story about how the collection not only speaks to the history of American art, but is also a reflection of your own history.
Yes, the one on the right is Chow Choi, and she is a California person. Her family immigrated from Asia, and but one of the motivating reasons for buying that painting, I must tell you, I have a niece who was adopted from Korea, and I just adore her. And she and I would go to museums together, and we went to the Met. And one day she was looking up at all the portraits, and she said, "Aunt Diane, how come nobody here looks like me?" And it really got me. And I said, I'm going to change that. And I'm going to make sure that people in this country that are from other countries or families came from other countries are represented. So when this came to market, even though I adore the other Henry, I just said, we have to have Chow Choi. And my niece my niece, it's for my niece.
Yeah.
And so that's why that painting is in the exhibit.
So I thought I'd mention next, it came up a little bit when you talked about Todd and the chairs, but so some of you may wonder, how does Diane, who was in St. Louis, now lives primarily in Ponte Vedra Beach near Jacksonville and is in New York a lot of the time, how did she come to be connected with the Mint here in Charlotte? And it's a great story. Some of you may remember our John Leslie Breck exhibition from last fall. That was a joy to put together and present to you all. Now I've been working on that show. These exhibitions take years and years to put together. And we had a colleague who is with us here tonight, Marissa Pascucci, or this afternoon, not tonight yet. It's been a long week.
Yeah,
It seems like tonight. Marissa had just moved to town and had kind of followed me at the Norton Museum as curator of American art after I came here. And she moved up to the Charlotte area, and I was talking with her about what was going on at the Mint and projects I was working on. And I said, I'm putting together this Breck show. And she said, do you know Diane Jacobson? I think she has a Breck, and I think you'd enjoy meeting her. And so she connected Diane and I about 5 years ago. And we just hit it off, and Diane generously lent that Breck painting to the show. You'll probably remember seeing it here about a year ago. And it was just the beginning of a fun journey into Diane's collection and us connecting and sharing a passion for American art.
You ought to know what she said about him. She said, he's terrific. He knows more about American art than any curator. He's just so knowledgeable. He's fun to work with. He's a great writer. He's a great editor. He gives good presentations. I said, sold. So thank you, Marissa.
That was great. And not long after Todd came, and I think this is from Columbia. I looked online. And Todd had worked with her on the art of seating, both in Columbia and on the way out at Arkansas as well, so twice.
You're going to have fun with the chair show. It's
It'll
really
be fun. But so we had two great connections with Diane, and had learned about this exhibition had started to be put together by a colleague of ours, and as things happen at museums, the colleague went to a different museum, and we were already very interested in being a venue, and our colleagues at the Dixon were as well. And so when our colleague moved on, we talked to our friends at the Dixon and said, well, let's keep this going. Let's really make this happen. And it's just been a joy to put together.
Let me tell you, it's a lot more work than they told me it was going to be. And he kept on saying to me, well, you're going to get to the fun part. You're going to get to the fun part. We've been at this now for 3 years or something, and grinding away and writing the catalog and doing all the work. This is the fun part. Thank you.
And as we put together the show, there we go, we have to make choices. And as Todd mentioned, Diane's collection, I think the painting and sculpture collection is almost 250 objects, and as I said, it keeps growing. But we have to make choices, and sometimes there are works, in this case, two works by the same artist and equally meritorious, and Diane and I would Todd and Kevin and I came up with what we wanted to show, and we'd forward the potential checklist to Diane, and she said, right back and say, well, why didn't you choose this one and this one? I think this one's important. And then we'd have to, it's hard because she's a professional negotiator. Remember, she went to school for that. And so, for example, we had wanted to include the Theodore Robinson Washing Day. And thinking about the whole context of the show and some of the things we wanted to do, and Diane said, well, I love the Neapolitan Child, and you can see they're both beautifully framed and they're both beautiful paintings. And I said, well, I want to talk about how Robinson went to France and brought back Impressionism to America. And so we had to kind of tussle and negotiate, and Diane finally relented, maybe a little bit.
Which means he won.
No.
He's the better negotiator.
No. But it was really hard to kind of pick things. Or when you look through the catalog, you'll see we could have picked 100 different things and had an equally amazing exhibition.
Do you think he was right? You have to say that.
So here's another one with the Stuart Davis, a wonderful example of this early American modernist work, and the Haywood Bill Rivers. And I thought I wanted to share this because it's an example of Diane's curiosity and eye for quality, and the fact that she's teaching me things about American art. So originally we had, if you go upstairs, you'll see there's a section on American modernism. And the Stuart Davis was originally in, and we were trying to make the show fit. And finally we said, well, what are we going to do? And Diane had lent us for many years this amazing painting by Heywood Bill Rivers. And we're trying to decide which one of these goes in. Stuart Davis is a much probably better known name within American art. And of course it's Main Street USA and the show's American made. And so at first we wanted to have that one in, and I said, I really want to have the Bill Rivers in the show because it taught me something about American art, and I think it's an equally amazing painting. And there's not room for both, and how do we negotiate this? And when Diane first bought this painting, and she said to us, do you want to have it on loan? And she said, this is a North Carolina artist. And I said, I've never heard of Heywood Bill Rivers. And so I kind of started digging in a little bit, and then she asked me to write the entry on him for the catalog. And I so much enjoyed learning about his background. He was from a small town in central North Carolina, went up to Baltimore for some training, and then went to New York and had an amazing career in New York and Paris, and then back in New York. But he is almost kind of unknown today. And she found this painting at auction and saw something in it and added it to the collection. I said, I think we really need to include this painting because I think he's a fascinating figure and more people deserve to know about him. And
so he won again.
No, but I wouldn't have known about it because I think it was really important for people to know that Diane gets paintings because they're really interesting, great paintings, and not just because of the names. And so of course, there are names that everyone knows in the show upstairs: Mary Cassatt, John Singer Sargent, etc. But there are also discoveries to be made and great paintings to be found out about, and like John Leslie Breck, I mean, people that need to be included in future stories about American art history. So hopefully we'll do more with Bill Rivers in the future, but this is the kind of thing where I have to thank Diane for bringing him to my attention, because I probably would have been a decade or two more before I came to know about him.
But also, he was right. At the end of the day,
No.
if the goal is to teach people about American art, you have to have a broad spectrum and different artists that they don't see all the time. He was 100% right, again.
So we have a couple of, thank you, but they're all good. We have a couple of examples where you can go upstairs and read the labels and learn about the art history and a bit about the artist, but the stories behind how Diane came to acquire things are equally as fascinating. So we have a couple of examples of fun things and how they came to be in the collection. The first one is this William Merritt Chase painting, and I thought people would like to hear about who might have owned this painting in the past and how you came to have it.
Okay. This is a scene in Italy, and the artist painted this scene and used somebody in the scene, the woman, who is a muse, basically. She was a person who was studying art, and very often artists use people that study art and work with them as their models. And well, I don't want to say anything bad about Chase, but on the other hand, he was having an affair with her. And when the wife found out, after she looked at the painting, she said, "Get that painting out of here." So that's why the painting came to market. It wouldn't have been available. It would have stayed in their home. So when it came to market, though, Frank Sinatra bought the painting. And he really adored the painting, but ultimately decided to sell it. And that's why I was able to buy the painting. So in this case, I was glad for the affair.
All the secret backs. This is why we have to have a conversation with Diane. You get all the secret backstories.
Oh, there's
about
so
them.
many. Every painting has a story, whether it's the way I acquired it or the way it was done. And it's so much fun to study all of this.
Yep.
When you really are being a collector, a curator, whatever your role is in art, get to the backstory. Read and study. It's really fun.
And with this one, which we chose for the title wall, sometimes even after you buy the painting, it's hard to take possession of it. When Diane told me the story, I said, you have to share this with people.
Okay. This painting.
Well, I'll start. First
Oh,
of all,
okay.
we chose this painting for the title wall because to me it represented so many things, kind of all of the great qualities about Diane's collection. First and foremost, it's just a beautifully painted work of art. Beyond that, it's by a female painter, and I think that's such an important part of the collection. It's also not Ameri Cassatt. It's by an artist who is not that well known, but you thought it was a great painting, and it is. And that's why it came into the collection. So kind of bringing new names into the canon. Beyond that, it has historical importance. It was shown in the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. And above and beyond that, it's also beautifully framed. But you found it, not in America, but abroad, and then it was a little bit difficult getting it over here.
Yeah. I never buy a painting unless I personally examined it and hopefully have a curator examine it and a conservator. But this was in London, and it was coming up, and I couldn't fly to London, so I hired a conservator who gave a glowing report, and it was in superb condition. And at the time, I was worried because I'd have to be dealing with a London telephone system or the internet trying to buy the painting, and I was nervous, so I got it at Bonhams, and they invited me down to their offices and assured me they had excellent internet connections, it wouldn't be a problem, but as a backup, we had the telephones, their lines, we had their cell phones. I went down to Bonhams, which is just on 56th and Madison, and sat there and started bidding on the painting, because by then I really wanted this painting. And we're online, and the internet went down. And my heart dropped. I really wanted this beautiful painting. I had done all kinds of research about where Hymettus was, and I really wanted it. And I said, oh, it's going to be lost. And then the phone rang, and it was the head of paintings in Bonhams in London. And he said, Diane, I've got this. Don't worry, I've got this. So we had the cell phone, we had the landline, and we're bidding by phone, my cell to his cell, and we managed to get the painting. You know, it was, and then the internet came up at just about, you know, towards the end, and I was able to see the other people bidding on it, and we got the painting. And I was just so happy. So then we had to ship it to the United States. And I had never shipped a painting from London to the United States. And I'm waiting, and it was properly crated and all the things you have to do. And I'm waiting and waiting because I wanted to be able to get the painting. And we're contacting they send it to the Port Authority because it has to be coming from overseas. And I'm waiting and waiting, and I'm saying, well, you know, we'd like to get the painting. And I said, can I come down? You know, I want to kind of, no, they said, you can't come down. I said, well, when am I going to get the painting? They said, well, we have to send the painting over to the FDA, which is out in Long Island City. I said, the FDA? Why are you sending a painting to the FDA? They said, well, it's something we have to do. I said, well, I want to be there. I want to see you patent. No, you can't. We're just going to send it to the FDA. So we're waiting. More weeks go by, and we're waiting. And finally, I'm calling the FDA and saying, you have my painting. I want to be able to pick it up. And I finally had to get to a little higher level. And I said, what is the holdup here? And the guy said, this was in Long Island City. And the guy says to me, lady, it's against the law to be shipping butterflies. I said, butterflies? No, it's a painting. It's an oil painting of butterflies. It says, right here on the label, it says butterflies. And worse, it's butterflies of a foreign country, Hymettus. I said, no, I promise you there are no butterflies there. I want to come out. We'll open the painting together. I promise you there are no butterflies. Let me come out. Nope. We got to put it in a contained room because if them butterflies fly out, we're in trouble. They finally opened the crate. There were no butterflies, of course. It's true, it was labeled butterflies of Hymettus. And you know, sometimes their labels on paintings are not necessarily accurate, but that's what it was. And so it took a lot of time to get it, but it against the law, lady. I was breaking the law.
We need to invite him to see the show.
Yeah.
There it is. That's great. And so paintings at auction, and sometimes, as you said, you can't see them and you have people go look at them, but sometimes it's hard to, again, get the painting. This one has a fun story behind it too.
I hope I'm doing okay. If,
Oh, you're doing great.
if I'm doing too much here, you tell me, because I'm not really explaining about the technical details of a painting as much as I am about the stories. But the stories are fun, they really are. And this painting is the result of a curator that I had met who was at the Palmer Museum. And he called me up on a Friday and he said, Diane, this painting by Schussele is coming up, and it's coming up at the Philadelphia auction. We would love to have it, but we don't have the money to be able to buy the painting. And we would love for you to buy the painting and then lend it back to us so we could enjoy it and teach people about this artist. I said, okay. When is the auction? And he said, it's Monday. I said, Monday? Okay. Well, have you seen the painting? He said, no. I said, how far are you from Philadelphia, where the auction was taking place? He said, it's too far, I can't get there. And I said, well, I'd have to evaluate the painting. I'd have to get somebody to examine it very carefully. So the net of it is I have a good relationship with the Philadelphia Art Museum and lend a lot of paintings to the Art Museum. And they said they would send their curator over and their conservator to evaluate the painting. And they did, and they came back and they said, well, it's dirty, it's got a layer of varnish on it, it needs some restoration work, and it happens to be in the wrong auction. It's in a European auction, so no wonder people didn't know about it. But this curator, Adam Thomas, is a diligent guy, and he knew Schussele. He knew that he had been shown at the Pennsylvania Academy. He knew that he had designed the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was really important, and this is a painting about the lessons in charity, and he felt it was really, really important to add to an American collection. So I don't usually buy anything sight unseen, but I had two curators, one from one museum, one from another, and a person who was an expert conservator, and they all guaranteed me that it could be restored, that the frame was terrible, but it could be restored. So the auction went ahead, and I bid on it. And I must admit, it was very reasonable because it was in the wrong auction. But it was unusual because he seemed to end it too quickly in terms of the bidding. Normally they're constantly seeking, trying to get somebody to bid more money. And this guy really wasn't. So I got the painting and it was a great price. Hammer came down and got the painting. And then they told me, sadly, that then the man passed away. So he just didn't have the energy maybe to try to get another bid out of it. But then they said to me that I really had to get the painting out because they were going to have a funeral. I thought, what next, So the museum in Philadelphia recommended a conservator because we couldn't move it unless it had been consolidated. You know what consolidation is, to make sure that nothing happens to it in the process of moving it. So I got in touch with the conservator, and she was lovely, Gwen Manthe, and she said, I'd be happy to help you. I said, oh, great. Could you go down and really get the painting ready? Because apparently we have to get it out before the funeral because they're going to close the place for several weeks. And she said, I'm in Alaska. She said, I'm on a project in Alaska. I said, what next, right? Somehow she managed to get a flight. She came to Philadelphia. She consolidated the painting. They used Japan paper to make sure that it's going to be okay. And she got the painting out before the funeral, and we got the painting. So you never know who's going to help you to build a collection. But I would encourage you to work closely with a museum. Join a collectors group. There is no better way to learn about art than to work with a museum very, very closely. Because I have relationships now with museums all over the country, and they teach me. That's how I learn. And I really encourage you to do that. And this happens to be a great museum, so.
All right, I'm going to move ahead of this one to this one, because I think it's important to keep it on time, because I have to get Diane to her flight. One of the other things we share besides going to the Met when we were young is we both love frames. One of the very first curators that I worked with, David Park Curry, was one of the first to really kind of see the importance of how a work is framed, because frames are often, as people collected art in the past, seen as kind of disposable. What we now know is that they're really important to an artist's vision for how a painting was perceived by the audience. But as paintings enter private collections and change hands, people kind of changed the frame to kind of match their decor in their house or to a different thing that they liked. And then we kind of came to realize that they actually were truly important to how a painting was perceived, and the artists often had very specific types of frames that they wanted to have with their paintings. And so, we've worked very hard here at the Mint, if you've been in the galleries and seen the collection change over time, to get everything into proper frames. And Diane has as well. And Diane is very diligent and will work for years and years and even decades to find the right frame. And this is a great example of that.
Yeah, this is a painting by Edwin Lord Weeks. And it was originally labeled incorrectly. And you should be very careful, because very often other people put labels on where a place is. And it turns out, in this case, that they were wrong. But I had a friend in Spain, and I asked her to go find the location. It was originally said to be in Cordoba, Spain. And she looked and looked and looked and couldn't find it. And then one day she was in Granada, and she came right up to the cathedral. She found the very spot. She took a photograph of it, and she sent it to me. And I was absolutely thrilled to know it was Granada. But also, from your history that there's a tremendous Moorish influence in Spain. And they came over and conquered, and they built beautiful architecture, which is replicated in the painting. You can see the balconies, and they are just so Moorish in architecture and so lovely. So I had been looking for a frame. I knew it was Spain, but I didn't know it was Granada at the time. But I'd been looking for a frame for 14 years, and finally came across this frame. And you can see the detailing around is very much the Moorish influence. And I always make sure that the frame complements the painting, doesn't overwhelm the painting. It kind of expands your view, but it doesn't narrow your view. And it's so important that frames are an art form, and we've overlooked it in many countries and ours, and I think it's really important. So I'm really happy with this.
Yeah,
Only took 14 years.
We talked a little bit about auctions. I wanted to talk just briefly about how these things come to your collection. Sometimes they come from Frank Sinatra's collection in the past. Sometimes they come from auctions, and sometimes it takes a while to bring two things together. That's the case with these two in particular. And you've done the story so beautifully on tours. You have to do it for these guys too.
Okay. I bought the portrait of George Washington by Rembrandt Peale quite a number of years ago. And as I started researching it, and the more I learned about it, I realized how important Martha was, his wife. And he was off fighting the wars and doing a wonderful job for our country. She was running the household, taking care of the kids, making sure that the farm made money. She was really, really working hard. And I wanted to have a portrait of Martha. And there aren't very many of them. And I think at the time, there were about 9 portraits of Martha. So it would be very hard to find one. But then all of a sudden, like magic, there was an auction that was going to have a portrait of George and a portrait of Martha. And they were not being sold together. They were being sold separately. So I said, okay, bite the bullet, Diane. Just go ahead and buy another George, so you can keep the person who buys George from buying Martha.
You figured they'd want them both.
I figured anybody would want them both, right? So the auction starts, and the price of George is going up and up and up and up and up. I mean, I said at some point, Diane, you should not do this. This is too expensive. You already have George Washington. Just be calm about it, and that's what you're going to have. You're not going to get Martha. And then that ended. Hammer came down. The man bought George, and he stood up, and he started to leave. And the auction people ran after him and said, no, no, sir, don't leave. No, no, Martha's coming next. Don't leave. And he stood up and he said, I didn't come here to buy Martha. I came here to buy George. I got me my George. My George is going to be at my ranch, and he's going to be in my office. And if you want to come see George, you just come to my office. And he left. He left. He never bid on Martha. And I was like, oh my God. And I got Martha. So now George and Martha are united. And I got me my Martha and I got me my George. By gummy.
And can you guess where the auction house was?
No, I shouldn't tell you.
Oh, goodness. So not only do you buy at auction, but I think you're diligent in finding things all over the place. And I think dealers and art fairs play an important role too.
Yes, and this was from Andrew Sholikoff. And I was lucky because the Barbara Haskell from the Whitney Museum had gone to this art fair. And she said, Diane, you've got to go over there and you've got to see this painting by Ralston Crawford. It's really, really important. It's a precisionist painting. I'll admit to you, I didn't know a lot about precisionism. And then Andrew taught me about it and Barbara taught me about it, and I started reading more about precisionism. And they convinced me that this was really important and I should buy it. I didn't really know what the scene was. I always liked to find where a painting was. I traveled all over the country looking for the spot, and I didn't know the spot, and I didn't know what that cone thing was. I don't know if anybody here knows it right away. Do you know it? But I finally figured it out. It turns out that it was a cemetery in New Orleans, and that cone-shaped thing is what they put the flowers in at the cemetery. So, and precisionism is a whole different area of American art, and it's very important, and I'm just thrilled that I had that, and I had help from both an art dealer and an art museum curator.
And I'm sure you haggled them down, because Diane is great about, she loves to buy at auction because you can get, oftentimes, really good prices on things, and when dealers get their hands on things, the price goes up. So, but I'm sure you got it to where you needed it to be.
Well, one of the advantages of working with museums, though, is that when you tell a dealer it's going to go to a museum, their really hearts are in the right place, and the price comes down.
Yeah. And so we're going to end with two things, a Cole and a Cassatt. And I think speaking about museums and dealers and things coming and going, sometimes things, Diane acquires things and they go to museums. Sometimes museums let things go and Diane rescues them. And that's really important too. And so that's how, actually both of the last two paintings came into the Foundation's collection. So I thought you could tell a little bit about how that happened and how a certain 5-year-old may have assisted with that process.
Okay. This, as you know, is Thomas Cole, and it was coming up at Sotheby's. And a friend of mine who lives in my building in New York has a grandson that we take with us sometimes to go look at paintings. And we came to Sotheby's, and the person responsible for American art very carefully explained all of the paintings and why they were important and all of the details. And so we were looking at the Thomas Cole and became really interested in it. And then if you could flip to the next one.
Yeah.
And then also we were looking at the Mary Cassatt painting. So after we had looked very carefully at the paintings, and it's one of the reasons why I think it's so important that you take youngsters to museums, this 5-year-old, Joseph, says to the head of American Paintings, now tell me, how did the artists make this three-dimensional?
I'll go back.
And she looked at, oh, you want to go back to Thomas Cole?
Yeah.
So she very carefully explained the essence of what perspective was. And he listened carefully and he said, oh, I think I'll try that on my next painting. 5 years old. I mean, it was amazing. So then we go through all the paintings and I say, well, now, Joseph, which paintings do you think I should buy? And he said, I think you ought to buy that one where the goat is falling into the river, which I hadn't noticed.
It's right in the foreground there. You see the goat's butt up in the air, going down the path.
I think, and that old fallen apart arch. I think you ought to buy that one. And then he said, I think you ought to buy that one with the lady in the orange dress and holding the baby. And I said, now, what is it about that painting that you like so much? And he said, well, I really like the fact that you can see the baby's behind in the mirror and see the crack. 5 years old. So, okay. The interesting thing is, those are the 2 paintings I ended up buying at that auction. And it was a 5-year-old.
Yeah, and the thing about them is that both of them were being deaccessioned by museums.
Yeah.
And were both quite controversial as that was happening, and the fear was these museums were letting things go and that they would go into private hands and never be seen again. And what happened?
Immediately, almost immediately. They didn't immediately go to museums because they had a little bit of work to be done. So when his grandfather asked him, no, it wasn't the grandfather, it was Joseph, the 5-year-old, asked his grandfather, so what did she end up buying? And he said she bought the Thomas Cole, the one where the goat was falling in the river, and she bought the one where the lady was holding the baby. And he said, please tell Diane that she needs to repaint that frame. 5 years old, he knew the frame was wrong for the painting. And look how wonderful the replacement period frame complements the painting. Yeah. But even at 5, art can be so important and enriching and educational for your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. They're really fun to take to museums.
Yeah, and so you got them both. The Cole went to Philadelphia until it came here, and the Cassatt has been here since Diane acquired it and is now in the show. But
thank you.
I think that's, to me that really cuts to kind of the mission of the foundation, is that you're acquiring great works of art from no matter what source. In the past, sharing them all over the country, and now bringing them together and to share kind of as a whole with 5 different museums. So thank you, Diane, for all of your diligence in building the collection and for sharing it and for your mission with education. We had calls with Diane as we were kind of leading up to all of the events for the week. And we were going through, we'll have this opening and do this. And I said, this is the fun part. And Diane said, nope. We're going to do tours, we're going to do programs, and we're going to educate people about American art. And I said, no, we're having fun. And so I think we've done both.
Yes, we have. Thank you.
So thank you all so much.
Thank you.